So welcome, thank you for joining me. I appreciate this is a tough slot. We're just before lunchtime and it's nice to see people actually coming in rather than leaving. So I'll try and keep this on time. My name's Chris Yule. I'm one of the senior security researchers at SecureWorks. I am based in Edinburgh in Scotland. I arrived here 2 days ago, so it's great to be here. Hopefully my mic is working. As was just said, SecureWorks is a company that monitors thousands of organizations around the world. My job, the research team's job, is to watch what's happening and then figure out trends and basically generate threat intelligence from that. We see a lot of interesting failures, and we're going to talk about some of those today. You might be thinking, if you don't know SecureWorks, how do we have authority to talk about this? SecureWorks has huge amounts of visibility. We have three main types of visibility. We have a lot of logs. We have customers in over 55 countries around the world, just under 4,500 organizations whose infrastructure we monitor. We collect about 320 billion security events from them every day. And we store that for 90 days in an originally named database called VLDB, very large database. We didn't get marketing involved in that one. And that's about 6 petabytes of security event data that we have in our data center. We have endpoint telemetry. So we have our endpoint agent that we call RedCloak. We have RedCloak deployed on 2 million agents, 2 million endpoints around the world. And RedCloak, that's really not very clear. RedCloak gives us full visibility of all activity on the endpoint, command history, process history, memory, etc. So in this case, which you probably can't read, we can see PowerShell being run from a command shell, which was spawned by Word, which was spawned by Firefox, which was spawned by Outlook. So clearly a full command chain history there of a phishing attack leading to a malicious attachment. So we have a lot of endpoint visibility. We also deal with a lot of incidents. So I'm based in the UK. This is a UK slide. So we're certified by the UK government to respond to advanced cyber attacks against national infrastructure. These kinds of certifications mean that we get the phone call when some of the most interesting incidents happen. And a lot of the most valuable intelligence that we get comes from working our incident response engagements. We're seeing firsthand what some of the advanced adversaries today are doing. If I was to distill all that into a tweet, I would say that SecureWorks knows data, we have the best data. Okay, so what I want to talk to you about today is, if you're a network defender, what is it that should be keeping you awake today? What's the thing that should be lurking in your dreams that might happen tomorrow? Normally when we do these sort of threat landscape briefings, we used to talk about sort of nation-state attacks. We talk about a whole series of different interesting things that happened over the last year. This year, we've kind of evolved to be talking about just one thing because of how seriously we're treating it. And that is post-intrusion ransomware attacks. So some of the ones you may have seen in the news, so this started a few years ago with SamSam attacks targeting a bunch of hospitals and healthcare providers in the US. Earlier this year we had Eurofins Scientific, which didn't go widely reported, but it actually had a massive impact. This was a global forensics company that in the UK, it turns out, they were doing 80% of the forensics work for the police. So all your DNA, your blood, sexual offences, murders, completely destroyed globally by a ransomware attack, which has had massive implications on the UK criminal justice system. We saw newspapers being attacked. We saw a bunch of local government organizations in the US and beyond being attacked. Earlier this year, we had Norsk Hydro, an aluminium manufacturer, completely disabled globally by a Lockergoga ransomware attack. We had Baltimore attacks earlier this year. And just to keep it fresh, this was 3 days ago. So Everest is a managed service provider. I think it's a subsidiary of NTT. So they were hit by BitPaymer ransomware and also a large radio network in Spain. We continue to see post-intrusion ransomware attacks having the single biggest impact on our customers when it hits. It doesn't hit everybody, but we have seen a massive increase in the number of attacks. And when it does hit, the impact is generally catastrophic. So if we look at a timeline of the main things that we've been seeing, so this kind of started in 2015 with the SamSam ransomware family. So that's a threat group that we call Gold Lowell. So as a threat intelligence company, we have to give ridiculous names to threat groups. The gold groups are the criminal groups that are trying to make money. So particularly in 2018, they became very active and made a fair amount of money. It turned out it was two Iranian guys who were probably associated with the Iranian Revolutionary Guard, launching a side gig to make millions of dollars. They were indicted by the FBI in 2018, and then immediately the SamSam attacks stopped, which was nice. Doesn't often happen that way. Then really summer last year is when things kicked into overdrive. So we had the Gold Drake group with BitPaymer. We had Ryuk appear in August of last year. Defray, November. Locker Goga started hitting organizations earlier this year, targeting a number of manufacturing and engineering companies in Europe and the US. Although since March, April, we haven't really seen much of Locker Goga. Robinhood earlier this year, and then laterally we've seen a big spike in attacks with Revil or Sodino Kibi or whatever you want to call it. These are kind of the main groups that we've seen using post-intrusion ransomware, and they're making a lot of money in our experience. The one I'm going to focus on most is Ryuk. I think, I haven't done a count of the number of incidents, but so we do 700 incidents a year globally for our customers, incident response. I would estimate that post-intrusion ransomware this year alone is probably in the region of 30 to 50 organizations that have been hit by one of these families. And Ryuk has by far been the standout family within that. So what do we mean when we say post-intrusion ransomware? We used to call it targeted ransomware. The idea that it was more of a kind of APT style attack. So where before we had crime groups using commodity malware to steal banking account details, try and get small amounts of money, we saw them move to this model of using more targeted attack styles, of gaining access to the environment, having actual hands-on keyboards, trying to do privilege escalation, achieve freedom of movement, understand the environment, get as much access as possible, and then deploy the ransomware globally to switch on in 1 hour. So essentially, you're disabling the entire organization almost immediately if you've remained undetected. So that's kind of the general model that they all use. I want to walk you through some case studies with Ryuk. So the first interesting thing to note about Ryuk is that the initial compromise almost always seems to come from what we would have previously called a commodity malware infection. So something like Emotet or something like TrickBot, two malware families that we see widely distributed by spam, not targeted, just a wide net, trying to get as many organizations as possible. We see Emotet leading to TrickBot infections, and then over time, we then see some of those TrickBot infections lead to Ryuk compromises. In this case, this organization, this was in March or April this year. This was an oil and gas retail company in North America with revenues of about $100 million annually. They were completely destroyed globally by Ryuk. So they had Emotet and TrickBot running in their environment for about 48 days. And then suddenly on day 48, we see a whole different suite of activity. So network scanning, PowerShell Empire being used to disable endpoint controls, and just much more intense access, where previously TrickBot had just been running like malware tends to do, stealing credentials, exfiltrating stuff automatically. Suddenly we see a whole suite of hands-on keyboard threat actor activity. We don't know for sure why that is, but the logical assumption seems to be that the group behind Ryuk, Gold Ulrich, are paying for access. So the trick bot operators have a botnet of compromised systems. The Riot guys choose which systems they want to potentially target with Riot. They pay for access and they use Riot as a route into the environment. So the key to remember is, so Emotet and TrickBot don't always lead to Riot, but Riot is always prefaced by Emotet or TrickBot. So it seems clear that there's two groups in operation there. So in this organization, they've had a malware infection for 48 days, and then suddenly we see a whole flurry of activity. So they already have the admin and service accounts. TrickBot has been operating in the background, stealing whatever credentials it can find. We see them using TrickBot to get into the environment, using ping to check routes, identify domain controllers, lots of use of remote desktop, PSExec. So no malware at this point. This is just somewhere in the environment, living off the land, using the native operating system tools to move around and understand the environment. We saw them using Bloodhound. So Bloodhound is a tool that you can use to visualize Active Directory. So really trying to understand where are the source systems, where are the key systems to access for a compromise. We see them very minimal intrusion footprint, no additional malware, just really building an understanding of the environment. So then at 9 p.m. local time on day 49, so less than 24 hours after we see this group first get into the environment, we then start seeing them staging their tools onto the domain controller. And when we say tools, we're using the word tools very loosely. There's nothing massively sophisticated going on here. So we see them deploying a bunch of text files. So every text file contains a number of host names. So it's basically a list of all the host names in the environment that they want to deploy the ransomware to. We see them deploying scripts that run PSExec on every system in the text files to deploy the Ryuk binary to the temp folder of every system in the network. And they deploy a script that when they run it will initiate the Ryuk binary. So very, very simple script. The Ryuk binary is not massively sophisticated. It just does what it needs to do. It's just on one system, doesn't move laterally or anything. It just encrypts everything that it finds. So then on day 50, less than 48 hours after their initial access, they come in using stolen admin credentials. They manually check the backups to see if they can get access to the backups to also encrypt those. And then they deploy the Ryuk ransomware on pretty much every host in the environment. And that is generally not a good day in the office if you are defending a network when that happens. So that's one case study of many that we have done in the last year and beyond. So we have done a lot of first-hand work in some of these chaotic environments that have suffered catastrophic attacks from these malware families. So what have we learned? That sounds scary when you essentially have a 48-hour window with an operator who isn't really using very much malware. You have 48 hours to detect them and stop them. As an industry, we often think that we have failed when we have the first malware infection. If we get malware on the machine, then we failed. But actually, in that case, we had a 50-day window from the malware being deployed to potentially stopping that actor from achieving their objectives and giving us a very bad day. So we have had some success of detecting and stopping these kinds of attacks. We helped respond to one of the big Locker Goga attacks earlier this year. I was the intel lead on that. So one of the first things that we want to do is get any intelligence that we can from those incidents so that we can then protect all of 4,500 of our customers from that. We were able to get the IP addresses, sorry, my laser pointer is not very good on here, but these white circles, or black circles that are white, are IP addresses. So the IP addresses the attacker was using to get into the environment. We use a data visualization tool called Labyrinth. I can drop the IP address and query all of our data sources, and immediately I can see, so these green dots are VLDB log instances where our customers have been talking to the IP address. This big cluster of activity here are our IDS signatures that have hit for that IP address. And these IDS signatures are for Cobalt Strike. So here I can see that I have top right and in the middle left there 2 customers that have VLDB log traffic to this IP address and also IDS hits for Cobalt Strike to that IP address. And we knew that in the LockerGoga instance that we'd seen, they were using Cobalt Strike. And I should say both of these things were about 1 month previously. So let's assume this was the start of April. These hits had happened at the beginning of March. And we had detected those and escalated those to those customers at that time. But armed with this new information that this is not just bog standard Cobalt Strike, this is potentially a precursor to a massive ransomware incident, we got on the phone to these customers and said, just to warn you, we now have extra intelligence on those IP addresses. It turned out that both customers had responded to the information that we gave them. One of them was successful in launching IR to essentially evict the operator from their network. The other was unsuccessful, and they had a very bad day after they had a LockerGoga ransomware attack. So kind of a success story. We were able to tell customers that something bad was happening. One of them was able to block it, one of them wasn't. And just to keep things fresh, so this was last Sunday. My team, so we're the CTU KIC, the cyber intelligence cell. So one of our threat hunters was looking at the Red Cloak portal just for some hits that he'd seen happening and realized that we'd escalated to an organization who I obviously can't name, but they are the very definition of a global organization. If this became a global ransomware incident, this was going to be a massive news story. So last Sunday, he detected Red Cloak triggering on a bunch of things that were good precursors of a Ryuk ransomware attack. Our SOC had escalated to the customer, but as I'm sure many of you know, sometimes tickets, it's difficult to know which are the important ones and which ones are not the important ones. So we had, one of our team had a personal relationship with the CIO at that organization. So we got on the phone with them. Less than 24 hours later, that company had stood up its IR team. They engaged us for incident response, and we continue to see Red Cloak just light up in this organization for everything that we expect to see with a Ryuk attack. So at this stage, it's genuinely touch and go. We think the actors in the environment, we normally have about 48 hours. Ryuk could hit them at any moment, and so we don't really know how it's going to go. But luckily, last week, this was a good news story for us. We were able to use Red Cloak to triage the damage. We identified 79 hosts with TrickBot indicators. They were isolated from the environment and blocked from the internet. We identified 53 other hosts that had showed logins by the threat actor, which is an indication that the credentials were compromised, but not necessarily those systems. So that initiated a global password reset throughout the organization. And then we saw another 100 or so systems that showed evidence of reconnaissance within the environment. So again, no evidence that those systems had been compromised. So that allowed us to focus remediation on the systems that we knew were compromised, do a global password reset. So if any credentials had been stolen, they were no longer valid. And I don't want to tempt fate because this is still an active incident, but so far, there has been no Ryuk attack on this organization. So that's a massive success for us. We were pleased with that. These were all of the countermeasures that we have in Red Cloak that triggered within that customer over a 24-hour period, which shows you that, I mean, we say Red Cloak is an agent of 1,000 tripwires. So these are the tripwires that the actor triggered in that environment, which shows us that it is difficult to detect these things and stop them from happening once they're in the environment, but it is absolutely possible if you're instrumented to look for these kinds of behaviors. Believe it or not, if this happens, your IR planning will absolutely be put to the test. We have seen some fantastic examples of massive successes and massive failures when it comes to incident response and these kinds of incidents. One LockerGoga attack that we had earlier this year, we went on site. We weren't doing the incident response, but the organization had asked us, as they rebuilt systems, to deploy Red Cloak to them so that we could monitor for any residual threat actor activity. So we went on site to help the organization. When we were on site, we found the customer's own in-house security management team. They had their existing managed security services provider on site who were UK based. They had engaged a local incident response company, local to their headquarters, to do the sort of forensics. They had a Big Four advisory consultant team on site. They had flown their in-house SOC from Eastern Europe to their headquarters. They had us on site deploying Red Cloak and trying to help them figure out if there was anything still compromised. There was various IT consultants helping just to rebuild systems that had been destroyed. There was reps from pretty much every security vendor that you could count, their antivirus vendor, their firewall vendor, their proxy vendor. I don't know what they were hoping to do, but they were there. They had, of course, zero usable IT infrastructure. Everything had been destroyed. No clarity on who was running the show. And also the politics of shame. So you have SecureWorks as a managed security service provider coming in with a new product like Red Cloak to show off to the customer how good we are. You have the existing managed security service provider who is probably outgoing, has clearly not seen something that could have prevented this attack from happening. It wasn't the most conciliatory environment, shall we say. There was a lot of politics going on within that. So if you can imagine in your organization, if this happens and you have all these people on site, does your IR plan live up to scrutiny? Will you know how to handle that kind of thing when you have no IT infrastructure to rely on? One of the key things is to have an incident commander. This is something that we've been doing for the last 18 months or so. So we've been doing incident response for years, and we have a lot of fantastic technical incident response consultants. What we see, though, is customers expecting technical consultants to do large-scale management of incidents. It's a very different skill set to doing forensics in an incident, to doing coordination and management. So we now have some very senior people that we offer as consultants to manage large-scale incidents like this. Often customers say to us, no, we can't afford that, we don't want to pay for that. And then we send them a technical consultant and they expect the technical consultant to do all the project management when he should be looking at logs and forensics and things like that. So absolutely, as part of your IR planning, make sure that you have accounted for the fact that somebody needs to be in charge of coordinating that. So a good example, the Situation Room, US government, maybe not a good example with who's in charge, but there needs to be clear accountability. Who's in charge? Who are the people around the table? Who do they report to? How do they communicate? We often get customers say, well, what does an incident response plan look like? Our consultants help you build, if you want, your IR plans. This is a screenshot I did from one customer that we did. So these were all of the documents that we created as part of the IR plan. And probably the most important is making sure you know what the organizational chart is, what the roles and responsibilities are, and how you communicate amongst teams if and when you have no longer access to email and things like that. And of course, rehearsing your incident response procedures is important. Tabletop exercises, planning for what happens in a ransomware incident. If you can come up with a good plan and a good scenario that you can engage all the stakeholders in to rehearse this, I promise you, having seen it go badly wrong, it is absolutely worthwhile doing that if you can. So another thing that we've learned, identifying when you've got incidents left, right, and center, and sometimes we do a good job of filtering out the false positives, but even if you only have true positive incidents, identifying which of those are a low priority one and which of those leads to, oh my God, we need to move right now, is a really hard thing to do. Very often you have security analysts in the SOC who can't see the wood for the trees. They're looking at individual incidents of things that have gone wrong individually, but without taking a step back and really understanding what the big picture is and what this might mean. Good examples, we often see SOC procedures that say if we raise a ticket to them, and the whole point of hiring us is that we're supposed to know more than others. If we raise a ticket to them, they'll run a virus scan, and if the virus scan says, no, I didn't find anything, they'll close the ticket as a false positive. And the whole point of paying us is that we're better than antivirus. So antivirus is a low-level security control. It's crazy how often we see that happen. So one case, this was a global travel company who we also saw indicators of a riot compromise earlier this year. So our incident response consultant was engaged with a local SOC analyst who was dealing with a very small incident. That IR consultant knew that the indicators that we were seeing were indicators of a much bigger compromise that had to be looked at. He had to persuade the SOC analyst, you need to escalate this to your management. So eventually, the IR consultant is then dealing with a local in-country CISO. We can see that the compromised accounts are coming in from another country that we don't have red cloak visibility of. So we're now trying to persuade the local CISO that we have to persuade the other countries to deploy red cloak. Eventually, we're then dealing with multiple regional CISOs, and they're all trying to coordinate until the IR consultant goes, this is a global incident, we need to invoke something. And then eventually, after about 36 hours, we're finally engaged with the global CIO. So that's a really difficult thing to know. When is it appropriate that the incident needs to be escalated up the chain? And we're a producer of threat intelligence. We offer TI subscriptions. And one of the things that we often hear customers say to us is, we don't know how to consume the threat intelligence you produce. Consuming threat intel is very hard. I was on a great presentation earlier on one framework that you can use to do that. But threat intel is more than just taking indicators and applying it to detect things and create new incidents. Incident response will be better if you use threat intel as a result of that. So here's another red cloak screenshot. So if we detect something unusual in your environment and we escalate it to you, there's quite a lot going on there. So we've had to do the research to know that this is bad. We've had to apply that knowledge in terms of signatures and countermeasures to red cloak. We've had to then use red cloak to detect that bad thing, and then we have processes and security operations centers in place to then escalate that to you. So if you're using managed security services, hopefully that's all an automated procedure. But that's actionable threat intel. That's us deploying something that says, here's something that you can block, go and block it and let us know if you see it. But as I said, it's also important that if you are escalating something, that threat intelligence is used to support that. So I was presenting something similar to this last year, and I was trying to think of a good example, because we often publish a lot of analyses on different malware families, and customers say to us, this is no use to me. This is like a 10-page detailed technical document that says what BitPaymer does or what Emotet does. I don't know how to translate that into something that I can use to block it. You don't always have to use it to block it. You can use it, so if you have an Emotet infection, you can then go and reference this document to tell you what Emotet is doing and how it's doing that. So a good example that I thought of to illustrate this, when I was in Florida last year, Hurricane Michael, I think it was heading towards me. And they were telling me that it was going to be a Category 3 hurricane. I have no idea what a Category 3 hurricane is. But fortunately, we have the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale, which tells you exactly what to expect with different categories of hurricanes. You have two very different types of threat intelligence happening there. If I gave you all a page today and said, here's the Saffir-Simpson hurricane scale, you're probably not going to be able to do very much with that information. But if somebody tells you there's a Category 3 hurricane coming for you right now, you're going to find that bit of paper and you're going to figure out what that means for you. The same is true for threat intelligence. We publish lots of different types of TI. Some of it is telling you, here's something bad that might be coming for you. You should take that and you should block it. But a lot of it is just good contextual information that if and when you hit that, you then have a reference of knowledge that you can then go to and use that to make your incident response better. Incidents and intelligence should feed off each other. We get new threat intelligence by monitoring all the incidents that our customers are facing and trying to learn from that and turn that into intelligence. That intelligence then allows us to generate new incidents that we would never have seen before, and so the cycle continues. So we can do that, but it's also important that our customers and you as defenders are able to have that feedback loop across both functions. Another thing we've learned is that paying the ransom doesn't make the problem go away. We have seen numerous organizations pay the ransom. The largest ransom that we have seen be paid was earlier this year. They paid $8 million to get the decryption keys for their ransomware attack. That was a Ryuk attack. We then got the decryptor for Ryuk. Fair play to the threat actors. They're very honest. If you pay them, they generally do give you the decryptor. But if we saw how unsophisticated the scripts they were using and the ransomware they were using was, imagine how unsophisticated the decryptor is going to be. With this organization, when we were very sleep deprived and helping them figure out how to do it, one of their sysadmins said, I don't understand why this decryptor is so terrible. This was basically a very simple application that you had to manually, interactively run on one system. When you have 60,000 endpoints that are globally disabled, that is not an effective way of bringing your systems back up. We ended up getting one of our malware analysts to reverse engineer the decryptor and change it so that we could deploy it using Active Directory and things across all systems. It was not an easy process. So don't expect that you can just pay the ransom and the problem will go away. And last of all, I don't think I do any presentation about security without talking about this, and I apologize. But more often than not, it's the little things, and I don't mean to use little disparagingly, it's the security fundamentals that we see. Had they been implemented properly, most of the serious attacks that we see would have been prevented. So one interesting little nugget, so if you're not using Microsoft Laps, you should be. So Laps allows you to manage local administrator passwords. So rather than using the same local admin password on every machine that, guess what, Emotet is going to steal and use to spread throughout your environment, you have a different password on every machine that stops commodity malware from spreading. Two-factor authentication continues to be the single most important control that we recommend to our customers. A large amount of post-intrusion ransomware attacks come from things like brute forcing RDP that's exposed to the internet. Don't expose RDP to the internet, use two-factor authentication. And of course, patching. So we've had a whole spate of vulnerabilities that we've had to publish to our customers on. A lot of VPN vulnerabilities, Palo Alto, SharePoint, secure, something secure, I've forgotten. Pulse Connect secure, that's the one. All of these are internet-exposed vulnerabilities that enable an actor to get root access in many cases. Making sure that you're effectively understanding what vulnerabilities are being revealed and patching against those, in addition to the other things that I've mentioned, is absolutely the best thing that you can do to try and prevent these kinds of attacks. So remarkably, almost exactly on time. If you are a network defender, I wish you luck. SecureWorks, we have a big presence here in Romania. We have over 700 staff here. We are always looking to hire new staff. We have a stand next door, so please do come and speak to us if you want to learn more. But other than that, happy to take any questions if anybody has any.
Thank you so much, Chris. We're going to take 3 questions, and of course, we're going to start with Lucian because he's always the first to pop on.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. I have a question. Recently, there's this trend where increasingly ransomware pushers are targeting managed services providers or managed security services providers. Yeah. How will companies deal with that when they rely on those companies to actually manage their infrastructure and manage their security for them, when the infection actually could come through that company because that company got compromised and obviously the attackers obtained access to all of their customers and then they can deploy?
Yeah, it's a difficult problem. It's not new to ransomware. So, I mean, we saw a couple of years ago the Cloudhopper attacks, Bronze Riverside, Chinese government coming in using MSPs. It often comes down to the fundamentals again. I used to do security assessment for large companies. I would often say, do you use two-factor authentication? And they would say, yes, absolutely. And then I would say, do you use two-factor authentication for your remote admins to log into your systems? Oh no, we have an exception for them. So absolutely, if anybody external to your organization is logging in, use two-factor authentication, and many times that will prevent any remote logins. But I appreciate that doesn't solve every case. So I could give a very long answer about all the security fundamentals, but sadly it is the fundamentals. It's maximizing trust, so making sure you're verifying their security, and then minimizing exposure. So if they do have access to your environment, make sure that attack surface is as controlled as possible. That's the only things that we can do.
Thank you.
Okay, next question. We have someone there in the back, here on the left. Please keep, oh, there you go.
I think everyone's gone for lunch.
Hello. Thank you very much for the nice presentation.
Sorry, I can't see you, right? Oh,
Yeah. I have a question related to machine learning. Can we learn the machine learning to make the difference between a false positive and a real incident?
I mean, it's a very timely question. We're having lots of discussions about that. So today we have used machine learning to make our SOC analysts more efficient. So our platform, CTP, escalates incident to our SOC. We use a system that we call 4C, which looks at the decisions that our SOC analysts make to say, if they say it's a true positive or a false positive, and it tries to learn what they're marking as false positives and reduce the amount of those that they're seeing. So absolutely, we can use machine learning to reduce false positives and take that burden away from our SOC analysts. Using machine learning to detect new true positives, which we weren't previously doing, is a much more difficult thing to do. We haven't found any effective solutions. We have a whole team working on it, and they keep coming to us for advice, and we keep telling them it's a very difficult problem to solve. And the only thing that they've so far been able to do is come up with machine learning algorithms to identify domain generation algorithms, which was great at detecting like Amazon and Cloudflare and things like that, but terrible at detecting anything malicious. So it wasn't the best. So that's a problem that we have, and we haven't got any good solutions for that yet.
Okay, one last question. If not, I think people are very ready for lunch. So thank you so much, Chris. Thank you once again.
Thank you.